Welcome to the Marjorie Lynn Bank Lecture Series at the National Aquarium. I'm John Racanelli, the CEO of the Aquarium. It's great to welcome you here. Let me start right off with a show of hands. How many people have been to a Marjorie Lynn Bank lecture previously? Great, okay. How many people are born and raised Baltimoreans? All right, we got a hometown crowd here. I love this. Let's see. How many people here were alive for the War of 1812? The end. The next question could be how many feel like they were. Well, most of you have been to our Marjorie Lynn Bank series in the past, as you know, and as those of you who are coming to your first will learn. It is a wonderful program. The story of Marjorie's life is told briefly on the back of your program. Be sure to give a look to that. But I always give a shout out to the Bank family, and especially to Penny Bank, who's not here tonight with great sadness, but got called away, for making this possible and for creating such a great program. It's been in place for many years now, but we really stepped it up this year with a renewed focus, especially on our nation's treasures and particularly the marine sanctuaries. We had Dr. Sylvia Earle, who many of you know, my old friend, her deepness. We had National Geographic photojournalist Brian Scary, who I think has got the best name because everything he does is scary. And then renowned filmmaker and photographer Bob Talbot, whose work is out in the lobby out there. That beautiful 5-screen Blue Wonders video, introductory video, was done by Bob for us. And then a guy who has the strangest job on earth was here from Hawaii. His name is Ed Lyman, and he is a whale entanglement response coordinator. Whoa. And if you thought that would be dry, you would be wrong. It was amazing seeing what that guy does, and he's saved something like 75 whales. So it's a wonderful program. It continues this fall, and we're excited about being able to kick it off this fall with this really exciting program where we're going to talk a lot about the history of this aquatic treasure called the Chesapeake Bay, and especially Baltimore. And if you've got 2 minutes to look out on the water tonight before you came in here, you saw some of the ships arriving. The excitement is beginning. Here we go. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be crowded. It's going to be all those things, but I think it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful 5 days here through the program, through the Star-Spangled Celebration. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to recognize our co-sponsors for tonight, because we have started a partnership several years ago, and it continues with Johns Hopkins University Press. And want to thank Kathleen Keene and her team for making this happen again. Thank you. The Odyssey program, which I think some of the members of and friends to Odyssey are here tonight, and its director, George Shepper, are great friends to us, and we appreciate their involvement in this as well. And I don't know how he gets to have multiple applause rounds here, but also Bert Kumarau and the Maryland Historical Society, who are central to this. Thank you, Bert. Thank you. Leave it to Bert to get applauded twice in one. Yeah. Or maybe it'll go 3 times if they like what you have to say. I also want to thank our board members who are constantly stepping up and helping us carry out our mission to inspire conservation of the world's aquatic treasures. I know that one of our board members is here, Jane Dropa. Give a little wave, Jane. Where are you? I saw you. There she is. My dive buddy. I don't know if Tom Robinson made it in. Tom, are you out there? I think he's still en route. And especially our volunteers, some of whom are here tonight. You can, if the ones that have been on duty are resplendent in their volunteer garb, but many are in their civies, and I want to thank every single one of them. We could not do what we do without your generosity and passion. Thank you. So with the start of our 200th celebration, the Star-Spangled Celebration, 200th anniversary of the end of the War of 1814, the Battle of Baltimore, and of course the penning of the now famous Star-Spangled Banner, we are launching a fabulous time in Baltimore. I, as some of you probably already know, did not have the good fortune to be born here in Baltimore, I got stuck with that state far out west, like my colleague in the middle here. I'm a native Californian, but I could not be more pleased about both being here in Baltimore and, frankly, starting to be able to claim a little bit of rights to being a Baltimorean. I'm starting to get it going on, and but I want to. There is a minor historical note that I was urged to share with you with 2 slides I'm going to show you. I first came to Charm City, coincidentally, during another citywide event, and it was the nation's bicentennial. Most of you, of course, were, I'm sure, not even born at that time, but some of us were. And if I can figure out how to run this thing. I was aboard a sailing vessel called the Explorer. It was, I was only 4, but still somehow I ended up its navigator at the age of 4. It was a little harder on the eyes than some of the beautiful ships that you see there, the Esmeralda and the Amerigo Vespucci, were that little guy sitting there. But the reason I wanted you to see this slide was the fact that if you look closely, you can tell where it's sitting. The Explorer tied up at an empty pier called Pier 3. It was a different time and place, but it was amazing then, and I think the tradition continues. As we left the port, if you look closely, you can see Federal Hill in the background and the Science Center, and some nitwit up on the bow blowing a conch shell. Reputedly yours truly. That was to say goodbye to Baltimore the first time, but I've come back many times since. And one of the things I've learned is even though Baltimore was very different back then, even in '76, the people haven't changed. They are patriotic, they are proud, they're resilient, just as they were in 1814 when they performed the incredible feat of turning back the British and saving the Republic. Other than that, I guess it was just a small accomplishment. So with that, I want to spend a minute telling you a little bit about our speakers, because these 3 gentlemen know more than most. Their work has delved into the history of the city, the state, the nation, and of course, how that pride, resilience, and patriotism reflected on the nation itself and influenced it. We are honored to have them here to help us kick off both our fall lecture series and the Star-Spangled Celebration. So with that, let me give you a very brief overview of the life and times of these 3 gentlemen, and then I'll let them actually get up and speak. And the way we're going to do things tonight is each will speak for 10 to 12, 15 minutes. If a question arises in your mind, did many of you get an index card, I hope? If you need one, just kind of sound out. We've got a couple staff members circulating. And by all means, jot your question or comment on the card. You can put your name on it if you like, but you don't have to. And then when all 3 speakers have had a chance to speak, we'll reformat up here, and I'll play moderator, and we're going to see how many of your questions we can answer. And don't worry if we only get a handful of note cards and you've got a burning question you didn't get a chance to write down, we'll figure out a way to get the mic to you and give you a chance to pose that question. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about Ralph Eshelman. Ralph's a cultural resource consultant. He's a historian, a researcher, and a writer. He was the founding director of the Culvert Marine Museum, author of several books, including The Travel Guide to the War of 1812, which is a book I have picked up several times, and it's just great. It puts it in perspective. Travel Guide to the War of 1812 in the Chesapeake. And with the aforementioned and soon to be mentioned again, Bert wrote In Full Glory, Discovering the War of 1812 in the Chesapeake. His work has included researching and writing the historic context study for oystering and fishing industries of the U.S. for the National Maritime Initiative. He's worked on cultural resource management plan for the U.S. Coast Guard. Referencing the War of 1812, he co-directed the Patuxent River Cultural Resource Survey, which I learned just recently discovered and partially excavated an American War of 1812 military vessel from the Chesapeake, a vessel from the flotilla. He was designated honorary colonel of the Fort McHenry Guard by the National Park Service in 2009. I love that. And currently serves as a consultant to the National Park Service's Star-Spangled Banner National Historic Trail Comprehensive Management Plan. With that, will you please join me in welcoming Ralph Eshelman?
Well, a very good evening to all of you. Isn't it appropriate that we're talking about the War of 1812, 200 years after the event? This is the bicentennial. And I'm sure that because most of you are from Baltimore, you all know that this is a very big week that's coming up for Baltimore. So what I thought I would do with the short amount of time that I have available is to try to give you a perspective of how this fits into the war. The War of 1812 is oftentimes referred to as America's forgotten war. I also believe it's America's most misunderstood war. And I can't get into the details, but imagine in June of 1812, the United States declares war on Great Britain. And they had reasons for that, and you can wrap them around a slogan that many of you have probably heard, and that's called free trade and sailors' rights. That actually simplifies it. It was much more complex than that. But for people that lived here in one of the major port cities of the United States at that time, free trade and sailors' rights, that was a big deal. So even though England was stunned when the United States had declared war on them, and initially didn't even react to it, but once the United States attempted to invade what we call Canada today, and I hope everyone realizes that Canada then was actually British colonies of North America, just like all of the United States at that time were as well. After they realized that the United States was serious about this war, one of the first things that they did was to declare a blockade of the Chesapeake Bay. And that was established in February of 1813. Now, why would they do that? Well, number one, they had a superior navy. They could afford the ships even though they were fighting Napoleon at that time. But number two, and most important, is they wanted to bring the war to the very seat of American government, and that's the shores of the Chesapeake. That's where Washington, D.C. was located. They wanted to let all of those politicians who dared to declare war on them to know that war is not a good time. It was not going to be easy. So with that blockade, it hurted trade. And one of the cities that suffered most was Baltimore, the third largest city in the United States in 1812. It was also an economic war as well as a military war. Because with the blockade, it restricted ships that could get out, it restricted ships that could get in. But on top of that, the British conducted raids up and down the Chesapeake Bay. In the spring of 1813, they went all the way up to Havre de Grace, where the Susquehanna River enters into the Chesapeake Bay, and essentially destroyed that town. But that didn't stop them there. They also went all the way back down to the mouth of the bay and tried to attack Hampton as well as Norfolk. They were not successful at Norfolk, but they were successful at Hampton. So the entire reaches of the Chesapeake Bay were being dashed by these redcoats that came in to our waterway. All of the tidewater of Maryland was affected by this war very early in the war. And that surprised a lot of people that lived in the Chesapeake, because when war was declared, most of the folks that lived here at that time never thought the war would come to them. They thought the war was going to be fought up along the northern border. Big surprise. Well, the biggest surprise came when the British defeated Napoleon the first time. And that meant that now ships and troops could be spared. And many of those troops came directly to the Chesapeake. Over 4,000 new, fresh soldiers that had just been fighting, not all of them, but some of them, Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula for the last several years. And this occurred in late July of 1814. I think you can all remember clearly in your history books that the British defeated the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg, and then it was a wide open pathway right into the nation's capital. There was no other defense. And we hear time and time again that the British burned the city of Washington. Not true. The city was not completely burned. It was for the most part the public buildings, but significant public buildings, like the Capitol and the White House and the War Department and the Treasury. But they did not burn the entire city of Washington, D.C., as many of us believe. But think about it, if we were living in this area 200 years ago on this very day, our big concern would be, where were the British going next? There was belief that Annapolis might be the next target. There was belief that Wilmington, Delaware might be the next target, and that might surprise some of you, but that's where the Dupont powder mill was located, the largest powder mill that existed in the United States at that time, a prime military target. There was also concern that possibly Philadelphia might be next, and some of you might be surprised to hear that, but if you remember, the British did exactly that same thing during the American Revolution. They went up the Chesapeake Bay, they landed at essentially where Elkton is today, and they marched all the way to Philadelphia, and they occupied Philadelphia. But the biggest concern for people that lived in Baltimore is that Baltimore was going to be next. And if you were a citizen living here at that time, it's very likely that you would have tried to do your best to help in the defense of the city. And that could be done in many different ways. Many of you, if you were males of the right age, you would be members of the militia. If you had a business, it's very likely that you would be donating money to the cause. Or if you came from a rich family, you might be doing the same thing. But many of you also would show up at the request of the mayor on designated days, early in the morning, to go up to what we call Hampstead Hill, now where Patterson Park is located, to help to dig fortifications to defend the city. Now, you oftentimes hear that it was the militia of Baltimore who saved the city, and that's partially true. But we shouldn't forget all of the support that also came from the other militia of the state of Maryland, as well as militia from from Pennsylvania, many of them from Philadelphia, but also from Virginia, and also from Washington, D.C. This was a united front. This was not just persons from Baltimore that put up the defense. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, 200 years ago, the cannon that existed on Federal Hill, which is in view of where we are right now, fired 3 quick shots in succession. That was the worst thing that the citizens could have heard. That was the signal that the British were coming into the Patapsco River. It was now clear that Baltimore was going to be the next target. If you were a militiaman, you took up your musket and you went to your rendezvous point to assemble. If you were not a militiaman, some of you would begin to make plans on taking anything that was valuable and begin to leave the city. What happened the following day? About 4,500 redcoats landed at a point that we know as North Point, and they began to march on the city of Baltimore. And this is not unusual. When the British did their depredations in the Chesapeake Bay, they usually did a pronged attack. That is where they would attempt to try to come in from at least 2 different directions, and in some cases they even came in from 3 different directions. And the British plan was to land an army that would march from North Point and try to attack the city on the east side. That was why the defenses on Hampstead Hill were so significant. The other prong was a naval attack, and the purpose of that was to try to take out Fort McHenry. And if they could take out Fort McHenry, those ships would then come into the inner harbor, and they could then blast the city, but more importantly, they could blast the defenses that the Americans had made on the heights of Hampstead Hill. So I would like all of you to just think about what it would have been like if you lived in this great city 200 years ago. You would have great fear as to what was to happen. And very few people could ever imagine it would have turned out the way it did. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
That's good. Thank you very much, Ralph. The tension mounts. This is amazing. Bert is almost at times one is inclined to want to say he needs no introduction, but he has to suffer through it anyway. President and CEO of the Maryland Historical Society, also president and I think founder of History Works, Inc., which makes history programs and projects for museums, historic sites, and historical societies accessible to the public. Bert has served the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, the Maryland Historical Trust. He's done work as a writer and producer for Maryland Public Television, multiple degrees from the University of Maryland, and a recognized authority on early American military and cultural history and materials objects from the 17th century to the Civil War. Found out tonight for the first time that Bert began his career as a ranger historian at Gettysburg and has consulted at dozens of historic battlefields throughout the East. And he is a founder of the 1st Maryland Regiment and Corps of the Continental Line, 2 internationally recognized recreated Revolutionary War units. Good friend to the aquarium and a great resource for Baltimore and the state of Maryland, Mr. Bert Kummerow. Bert?
Well, we all know that all politics are local, and Ralph set this up beautifully. We are here commemorating this moment in time, which was life and death for the city of Baltimore. Had the British gotten into the city, you can't even imagine what would have happened. And I like to think a little bit about, some kind of image about all this. There were a lot of people, of course, who went into the trenches and were working really hard to defend the city. But just like in Washington a few weeks before, there were lots of people who fled for their lives. And we have that great image in the movie Gone with the Wind of the Civil War Atlanta and all the people just running to and fro during the confusion when the Union troops were on the outside of the town. And I think there are letters about the fact that there were lots of people piling stuff in their carriages and getting out because they knew that this was really big trouble, not only for the city of Baltimore, but for the whole nation at large. So Ralph set it up beautifully. I think we really have to remember that this was a life and death moment for this town. And when they stepped up and they were able to stop the British, these are the best troops in the world, and this is the best fleet in the world. They had terror weapons. They had brand new weapons that were the cutting edge of weapons around the world. These bombs and these rockets, so remembered by Francis Scott Key in the Star-Spangled Banner, were brand new weapons that were terrorizing people. And those 25 hours of bombardment at Fort McHenry that led to the moment in time when the British decided that they weren't going to make it. 1,500 of these 200-pound bombs, and some of them survived. There's some at Fort McHenry, there's some at the Maryland Historical Society, which exploded in the air for the first time. These were explosive shells and spread shrapnel everywhere. Somebody commented at Fort McHenry that they all felt like they were pigeons tied up by their feet because they really could do nothing except hunker down and hope that the British would get close enough so they could fire at them. So that moment is really, really, really so important to this city. And yet, what I wanted to comment on, there's 2 things I wanted to comment on. One is the fact that we're going to have a lot of celebrations here this week and fireworks and Blue Angels and all the other things, and everybody has a great time, enjoys the tourist opportunities in cities and goes home. I hope that all of you will remember that this is commemorating something that was pretty formidable for the brand new American nation, only 20 years old. And it did lead to a lot of good things as the war ended, but we got out with our skin, and we were really, really, really lucky. This was a world war going on, and we were just a footnote. There was a great article just brought out in the Smithsonian Magazine by a historian that I think is wonderful, Amanda Foreman. She's written lots of books about the 18th century and the Civil War, and she just put in an article about the fact that she was raised in Great Britain, and she had no idea that all this had happened, and she was embarrassed to say she didn't really remember it. But she talked about the 4 versions of the war, and the 4 versions are based on where you lived and what you perceived when the war happened. And we're not talking just about the War of 1812 here. We're talking about a world war that had been going on 100 years between France and Britain. And that particular war led to, of course, the Napoleonic era. And they had been fighting Napoleon for about 20 years. So this gives you a whole different perspective. From the American point of view, as Ralph pointed out, it was the Second War of Independence. We later called it the birth of American freedom. And in recent years, we've gotten into other subjects that have been mined quite beautifully by modern historians. One is, of course, the entrenchment of American slavery after that war that led to this, eventually to the Civil War. The jumping off of our conquest of the continent and all the things that led to us being the United States that we are today. And then finally, the industrial capitalist society that we hold so near and dear today. All those things didn't really involve the British very much, but after the war, we became friends enough. We had some skirmishes on the border to go on to a pretty good peace, and now we're, of course, good allies. Another point of view is the Native American point of view, and that, of course, was this ongoing conquest of the continent and conquest of a Native American culture and way of life. And one of the great heroes for Canada during that war is probably one of the greatest leaders that the Native Americans ever had. He dreamed of having a nation that would put all the alliances of the various tribes together and would force the Americans back, from conquering their land. His name was Tecumseh, and he was killed in the war. He was a martyr for the Canadians. So we get to the Canadians, okay? We thought at the beginning of the war, because we had a bunch of rabid congressmen out on the western frontier, led by Henry Clay, who thought we got to get rid of the Indians because they're really causing a problem for us. They'd been fighting them for decades. And, by the way, we might be able to get Canada. That might be a really nice addition to the United States with double the size. The Canadians are celebrating right now their independence. We tried at least 10 times during the war to get into Canada and conquer Canada, and it all ended very, very badly. This all over 3 years. So in spite of Thomas Jefferson's comment that going into Canada would be a mere march, we found out that it was a lot different, and they weren't so excited about becoming Americans. So that's number two. Now, number three, finally the British. And Amanda Foreman comments about the fact that the war is little perceived and hardly known in Great Britain. We've certainly been hollering loud enough over here, so we've gotten their attention, and they've been over here helping us commemorate this war. But when you look at the Napoleonic War compared to this War of 1812, 3.3 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars. Somewhere around 20,000 died in the War of 1812. So there's a good reason why the British had something else going on, and that's one of the, course, the reasons that we declared war. They were flabbergasted that we declared war against them over minor issues as far as they were concerned. The impressment, which was such a big deal, and Ralph's free trade and sailors' rights, it was just an issue, and they felt that they could neglect it, and of course they found out differently. And they also thought that the Americans were charlatans because they were talking about these ideals of freedom, constitutional government, and here they are declaring war against one of the best constitutional governments in the world. And so the early victories that we had in 1812 led to a long period of real trouble, and Ralph talked about that a lot. I want to mention just briefly that Ralph and I got loose on this book because we were trying, this is the book in Full Glory Reflected, because we wanted to make this era come alive. And I learned when I worked on a book in Pennsylvania that if you get some really good artists working, really good illustrators who know the period quite well, you can at least develop a concept of what it was like. We all know the past was a foreign country. I mean, it's gone. All we can do is go there in little bits and pieces, and sometimes we get what we feel is moderately close. So this book has layers. And whenever you go to a museum, you have 3 layers of people who are looking at the exhibits, and we were trying to get to all of them. You have the streakers, like my brother, who never reads anything. He likes to look at the pictures. Then you got the strollers, and that's the great mass of the audience that, we're interested in me, find some stuff here and all that. And then you got the studiers, and those are the people, of course, that we represent up here. Every label is important. And they're the ones who want to know everything about an exhibit. And that's what this book is designed to do, is try to appeal to different kinds of audiences. So I hope that you'll have a chance to look at this book, because it's a labor of love, and it really does talk about what Ralph and I are talking about tonight. This incredible war that nobody remembers, that almost lost the Americans everything, but at the same time created this great move towards the future. And when Francis Scott Key wrote this song, after he'd observed this amazing moment. You imagine sitting out in that fleet and watching a 25-hour bombardment and wondering what in the world happened. And then seeing that flag, it probably was an emotional moment for people all over Baltimore on the hills watching this whole thing happen. And that's the moment that led to the American future. And that's why this song is so important, and why this moment is so important to the history of America. But remember, folks, it's a footnote. It's a part of a big continuum of the American and the world experience. So we're going to go on to the Star-Spangled Banner, because it's such a great story. And thank you very much.
You know, one of the things that we don't reflect on, we should, is, as Bert kind of called our attention to it, is if things had come out differently, just imagine if the British had won, we would have to speak English. It's a shocking thought. And by the way, I like to think of myself, obviously I'm a museum guy, I like to think I'm a studier, but so far all I've been able to do is streak through that book. But I'm going back, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Mark Faris is a freelance writer whose works appeared in the New York Times, Newsday, Time Out, New York, Spin, Vibe, and elsewhere. I like that. He's kind of covered all the media, traditional all the way to digital, and became interested in the Star-Spangled Banner while working on an MA in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He took a Smithsonian Institution fellowship and spent the summer of '99 gathering sources by combing through the archives here in Baltimore and also down in the Capitol. And this book that he'll be talking about the Star-Spangled Banner, combines his dual love of both history and music. And so with that, will you join me in welcoming Mark Faris?
Well, those are two hard acts to follow, that's for sure. But thank you for the vivid accounts. That the song provides a sense of relief to you. You captured how the city was on edge. And of course, you know the song kind of has a big sense of relief. It is definitely a privilege and honor to be here in Baltimore. I thank you so much for bringing me here. As a lifelong New Yorker, I give you an outside perspective of Baltimore and its historical legacy. I've had a long association with Baltimore. For some reason, since I was a young man, I was an Orioles fan.
Hey! Oh! Oh!
Brooks Robinson played a little role in that. However, it is Mets first, Orioles second. I'm sorry. Sorry. One of my first freelance articles I remember way back was about the Great Fire of 1904. Who was alive for that? It devastated the heart of downtown, and I wrote it for Firehouse magazine. I don't think it's online, so it's in a hard copy in a storage room, gathering dust as we speak. And I do make a mean crab cake. So I do consider myself to be an honorary Baltimorean, mostly because I came here to pursue facts about the Star-Spangled Banner. Thanks, as John said, to a Smithsonian fellowship, I did comb the repositories, including the Maryland Historical Society. I know, I went to UMass. I can't get that out of my mind. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, except for the time that I spent in Massachusetts studying. And Baltimoreans, you must definitely take pride in the city and your history. Beyond fending off the British with a very valiant stand against the world's then superpower, had Baltimore not taken to the Star-Spangled Banner, it may have fizzled and withered, and we wouldn't know the song. And that would be a shame, because Francis Scott Key did not promote the song. He was very self-effacing, and it was up to the people of Baltimore, the printers, actors, And just the soldiers in Fort McHenry, they kept singing it, and they made it such a force that it rolled over the rest of the country, as chronicled in the book. And I argue that it became almost the de facto national anthem very soon after the war ended. A lot of people think that it started in the Civil War and that it took a long time in the late 1800s to become the national anthem. But I argue that it really was almost instantaneously the key song in the nation to embody the nation's nationhood. Baltimore is also a big city of firsts. The Defenders commemorated the events of 1814. 1 year later, in 1815, there was an informal gathering of the Defenders, and they formed the seed of the first non-exclusive veterans organization. If you remember, the Society of the Cincinnati, formed after the Revolutionary War, was only officers, but Baltimore was far more democratic. And there are a few holidays like Defenders Day, a localized 4th of July. There's Evacuation Day in Boston, but Defenders Day is pretty cool, and you should be proud of that. In 1942, this open veterans organization incorporated as the Association of Old Defenders of Baltimore. And they eventually merged with other statewide organizations, with Pennsylvania taking a large role in that, as the General Society of the War of 1812, and that happened in 1894. And those hereditary veterans groups were pivotal in making the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. They lobbied Congress hard and fast for that. As you know, Baltimore completed the first battle monument in the entire country to the War of 1812, and that led John Quincy Adams to coin the slogan, Monumental City. Does that ring a bell for you folks? The monument is on the city seal, but I feel like Charm City is kind of overtaken, and I'll get to Charm City in a second. Baltimore did commemorate, this is the 200th anniversary, and Baltimore, yes, is going to be going crazy. But they would have celebrated 50 years after the event, but the Civil War was going on. And so no celebrations of the War of 1812 or the Star-Spangled Banner. In 1889, not much happened either. I didn't find anything in the archives about that. But in 1914, Baltimore went wild, as you may know. Major commemoration. The booklet by all the committees is this thick. And it was sort of a coming out party for that fire of 1904, which devastated the heart of downtown. So Baltimore kept the Star-Spangled Banner in the nation's consciousness, and that spurred President Wilson to sign an executive order making the song the national anthem. But he considered it only to be relevant for the armed forces. He figured that Congress had to give the official stamp. But that was a big event in the drive to make the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. And then, of course, you have the local characters like Congressman J. Charles Linthicum and my favorite, Mrs. Reuben Ross Holloway. Every nonfiction author should find a Mrs. Reuben Ross Holloway. She was a great character who crusaded for the Star-Spangled Banner, and she got into a tiff with the veterans of foreign wars over who deserved credit for actually tipping Congress to take the vote in the House of Representatives did it in 1930, and then the Senate took it over in 1931, and then Hoover signed the law in 1931. But without Mrs. Holloway, it might have taken longer. And she's a great character. She used to go around Baltimore policing uses of the flag and patriotic commemorations. She was great. In 1939, Baltimore did celebrate the 125th anniversary, partly to offset popularity of America the Beautiful and God Bless America, which has just become very popular. There was a headline, there was a Gallup poll that took place in 1939, and the results were pretty grim, that Americans didn't know the words, and they didn't even know that it was the national anthem. And one of the headlines in the newspaper was, Poll confirms Mrs. Holloway's concern over the lack of knowledge and lack of proper respect for the Star-Spangled Banner. It's definitely great stuff. The 150th anniversary in 1964, also, like 1939, coincided with the World's Fair in New York. So Maryland went to the World's Fair and promoted the Star-Spangled Banner and the anniversaries. There was rain in 1964, unfortunately. And the book also chronicles how patriotic groups were falling out of vogue at the time. It's the 1960s, as you know, and there's a little bit of a backlash against rah-rah patriotism. I found a very interesting source, I believe it was at the Maryland Historical Society, where some of the Society of 1812 presidents are writing about how they can't find people to come to Flag Day and other commemorations like that. So here we are, the 200th anniversary, and the eyes of the nation are upon the city. Baltimore is a major character in this book. I could not help but have the facts keep bringing me back to Baltimore being a major actor in the history of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is obvious, but still, it's something that I think Baltimoreans may take for granted because you're so familiar with it. So, as I drove from Fort McHenry through Federal Hill neighborhood, I had never been there before, and it's a beautiful, beautiful neighborhood. Row after row of historic buildings. Baltimore has great bones, there's no question about it. And I remember walking, I was doing research at the Pratt Library, and I remember I parked in a parking lot, and I was walking, and I said, you know, in a way this book is going to be a little bit of a love letter to Baltimore. And I understand that Baltimore is a beleaguered city, and maybe a lot of people think that the wire represents the city and you have to defend yourself against that. I would say that, you know, obviously Baltimore has no monopoly on urban blight or inner city problems, and it really is a shame to see that happening all over the country. But one thing that I would like to propose is perhaps to help refurbish the image is to propose a new nickname. Monumental City fell by the wayside. Charm City is a little bit, sorry, I don't know how you feel about it, but John mentioned it, and it was an artificial construct in the 1970s. The mayor and a bunch of advertising execs decided to get together and institute it, and it has been taken up. I walked through the mall, and it's, you know, life is good in Charm City. Councilman James B. Kraft recently proposed that Baltimore should be called the birthplace of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, that's great. It's a little bit cumbersome. Maybe you should call it National Anthem City, or Anthem City for short, or Star-Spangled Banner City. That refers to the flag, it refers to the song, and then you could explain to people, you know, well, you have the flag and it inspired the song, it could spur you to tell the tale. Maybe? And this would underscore the role played by your forebears making this great song that we're celebrating this week, which commemorates that great moment in 1814 when, against all odds, Baltimoreans defeated the great world superpower. And now this song serves as the emblem of nationhood. Of course, changing a slogan is superficial. It's not going to gloss over the problems, but that way, whenever the song is heard, the legacy of Baltimore perhaps will become more central to the nation's consciousness. Thank you.
Very provocative. Somewhere in there's got to be some kind of acronym around charm and monument, and we get so many letters out of Star-Spangled Banner. Right? There's got to be something we can work with that on. I don't know. Well, we have a few questions. First of all, I want to implore you now to, if you have had time to compose a real brain twister of a question, please pass them to the aisles on the outsides. And we've got staff, the lovely Emma Connor is waving from one side and Roz on the other side. Just pass them out to the aisle, and they'll collect them and bring them down here to me. unvarnished and unedited. And I've got a couple already collected here, so I'm going to go ahead and start. And I think the way we'll do this, how much time do we have, Holly? 10 to 15? Okay. And by the way, in that classic, adage about I don't want to stand between you and the bar, I don't want to stand between you and the bookstore, because all three gentlemen will be at tables right at our bookstore around the corner here, our gift and bookstore, and we'll be signing these great books. And you can, if you have a copy with you, they'll sign that, and if you haven't had a chance to get one, you can get it here. So love to do that. So the first question I'll just throw generically out, and maybe one of you can pick it up. We've got mics all over up here. Please talk about the impact of some of Maryland's lesser-known heroes like Joshua Barney or Charles Ball in the broader War of 1812.
Go for it. He's the guy, Joshua Barney.
Okay, Joshua Barney.
Yeah.
Born on Bear Creek, Baltimore County. Significance of Barney is that because the British had a superior navy, they could operate in the Chesapeake Bay at will. There was no navy from the United States side to try to stop them. So along came Joshua Barney, who was a hero in the American Revolutionary War, and he was also a privateer early in the war. He came up with an idea that he presented to the Secretary of Navy on July 4th, 1813. And what he proposed was to take a bunch of barges, some of which already existed, but others that would need to be built. And they would be mounted with a cannon on the bow and a cannon on the stern, and there would be two different sizes, a 50-footer and a 75-footer. And this was authorized by the Secretary of the Navy. Some of those barges were built right here in Baltimore. A few others were built in St. Michael's, which was a major shipbuilding community over in Talbot County. And then in the spring of 1814, he began to train his sailors on how to maneuver these vessels. And his plan was to try to go out and harass the British. And by having these smaller barges, what he reckoned he could do is he could do a sneak attack, and then he could retreat into the shallows of the bay where the British could not follow in their larger boats. And the other thing that's pretty interesting about these barges is that they could be rowed and they could also be sailed. And most of the British vessels did not have the capability of being rowed. And any of you who are sailors, you know that here in the summer, the Chesapeake Bay is not always the greatest place for steady breezes to get to where you want to go. So it was a great plan, and I don't have the time to go into it because it's really a fascinating story. But unfortunately, Barney is heading down the bay to attack the British stronghold, which is Tangier Island. And he begins to see sail, and he realizes that there's no American sail. These had to be British. And as he got closer, he realized he was running right into the full British fleet. And what he wanted to do was to try to escape up the Potomac River so that he could get to the Navy Yard. There were two significant Navy Yards in the Chesapeake Bay at that time. One was just across from Norfolk on the Elizabeth River, and the other was on the Potomac River. But contrary winds and the British moving so quickly, he was unable to do that. And so the next place of opportunity was to come into the Patuxent River. And that's where he got bottled up. And we ended up having a series of skirmishes between the British and the Americans, what is known today as the Battle of St. Leonard's Creek. And that's the largest naval engagement that ever took place in naval waters, ever. Not just the War of 1812, but the largest naval engagement ever to take place in Maryland waters. So many people look at Joshua Barney as a hero from the War of 1812, even though he was never successful in being able to carry out his plan of harassing the British.
And Charles Ball was a member of the crew. And these naval vessels, internationally and locally, were manned by black and white sailors together. And it was an integrated fleet. And so it wasn't unusual for Charles Ball, who was a cook, I think, on one of the flotilla vessels, to be involved with the white crews. And he later left behind a narrative of his experiences, and that's why he's so well known. I did want to mention one last thing, and that's that 4 cousins descendants of Joshua Barney, who ended up going to Pittsburgh on his way to Kentucky and dying there, have come back to Maryland, come back to the Maryland Historical Society, pulled out an enormous number of things, including 1,300 documents that have never been seen before.
Wow.
And they have loaned them to the Maryland Historical Society, and we have those many of those things on display right now. So for the first time, a lot of Joshua Barney's personal items, both his war items and his personal items at home, are in our collection, and we're hopeful that they'll be donated.
We've got some really great questions here, so I'm going to try to get through a handful of them here. And first, interesting one, and I've never heard this question asked, nor have I heard the answer. So let's see what one of you gentlemen can do. Why did the British leave Washington after occupying it for only one day?
Both Ralph and I can do this. They weren't intending to stay there very long. You can imagine this American army, which outnumbered about 2 to 1, had fled for their lives, but they didn't go away. They were hanging around, and they didn't know where they had gone. So part of this thing, it was an expedition, and they were there to cause trouble and then not occupy the town. They couldn't have done that. They didn't have a big enough force. But the other thing that happened was that on the next day after the burning of these buildings, when the fleet was, when the British were there mopping up, basically, a tornado came through. And it absolutely flabbergasted everybody because it was such a violent storm that it caused all kinds of trouble. And so I think that there was a lot of reason why they didn't stay very long.
God's country, you see. It's God on our side. Another interesting set of questions. What is your understanding of life in Baltimore right after the September 14th defeat or repulsion of the British? Did trade resume right away? Were ramparts taken down? Was the militia disbanded? How did Baltimore respond after the British sailed away?
Just the opposite. They were fearful, the citizens as well as the military were fearful that the British might even come back.
Huh.
So instead of dismantling the earthworks and all the defenses, in fact, they were even fortified beyond what they had when the British attacked. So it was just the opposite of what you're asking about. And then as far as trade being restored, the British still had the blockade across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. That blockade did not leave until 1815. So the city was still suffering from lack of trade because of the British blockade.
One of the vessels that was a famous privateer was called the Chasseur, and after the war basically was over and the British fleet was getting ready to leave, the Chasseur had gone down to the Caribbean and fought a big fight with a British vessel. And they returned almost on the date of what became Maryland Day in March of 1815. And the cover of our book is a painting by a really well-known local maritime artist by the name of Patrick O'Brien, different from the author. And this is a wonderful moment when Baltimore was able to welcome back this ship that was so famous. And our picture is of them trading salvos with the Fort McHenry garrison. And a week later, Hezekiah Niles, who had the first really, really important weekly newspaper in America, branded the Chasseur the pride of Baltimore.
I have one aside. One thing germane to the Star-Spangled Banner is that the newspapers did start publishing again. Within a week after the battle, they had shut down, and it was the Baltimore American that did publish the first broadside. And they called it, the young apprentice printer called it Defense of Fort McHenry. You will see many, many people refer to Key naming his piece Defense of Fort McHenry. But the manuscript in the Maryland Historical Society,
Now down at Fort McHenry for 10 days.
now down at Fort McHenry for 10 days, has no title. Key did not title the piece.
Oh.
The printer titled it Defense of Fort McHenry, and then Thomas Carr, the music publisher, called it Star-Spangled Banner. And for us studiers, when I write in the book star hyphen or dash spangled banner, the reason why I did so, and Thomas Carr did not, is because Key wrote Star-Spangled Banner in every verse 4 times with the hyphen. So thus I claim, and there really is no correct usage of the title in print because he didn't give it a title, but I claim that the Star-Spangled Banner is correct.
Hold that mic, Mark, because
Hold
we
the
got
mic.
another one for you here. Although I just thought of something. I don't think we want to go with the slogan of Baltimore, the Star hyphen Spangled Banner City. So we got to work on reducing that.
Anthem City.
Anthem City's good. Are there any notable differences between the original Star-Spangled Banner with that hyphen? Here, I'll put it in. And the version we now know. Any differences between what he wrote and what was known then versus what we sing today at Orioles games? And I'm not going to, we don't want to, we know that one thing that we do that probably Francis Scott Key didn't expect was the part about the O. We won't go there.
Interesting, yes, the O. The Orioles are not the only team to do that. You know this, right? Atlanta Braves, home of the Braves. The Dallas Stars, Oseda's the Star. The Houston Rockets, Red Glare. And I don't know if you know this, but it's a tradition at Chicago Blackhawks hockey games to try to drown out the banner. They scream so loud, they try to drown out the banner. I don't
Chicago.
You know, it's so cold that they've got to scream to get warm. There is no official version of the music of the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, that is one thing that in the 1950s, a hapless congressman from Virginia tried to do this, and he had a PR nightmare. His name was Joel Broyhill, and he just wanted to come up with an official version to keep from jazz versions or, you know, what happened with Jimi Hendrix or other versions down the road, to try to set it in stone. And the American Legion was for it. The Maryland Historical Society was for it at the time. However, a lot of the hereditary groups, Mrs. Holloway's types of groups, like the Daughters of the American Revolution, they were against it. It was a very rare split between veterans and hereditary groups. But there is no official version of the music. And the official version, they decided in the hearings, Congress held 3 days of hearings, they decided the official version of the text is the version of the original key manuscript that is in the Maryland Historical Society.
Thank you.
One of the most interesting things that I discovered when looking at the music, and I am not the expert on the music of the Star-Spangled Banner, but I do play, and I do love music, is that in the original version, the first 2 notes are the same. So it would go, oh, say, can you see? Not, oh, say. That just came in through folk addition over time. Also, the phrase ramparts we watched was ramparts we watched. Very, one note, one beat per note. We sing it now, ramparts we watch. That came in through, again, folk usage. And that to me, are 2 interesting changes.
If you hear the way it was originally sung, as much as we know, you'll see it's quite a different song. It's very, very lively. We tend to sing it very solemnly, and I think they sang it as they sang the Anacreonic Song, which was a very popular song in that era, used for lots of different versions. It really was sung very lively, and so it's quite a different version. It's fun to hear.
Well, I got Holly's giving me the hook comes next, so we could either ask we could ask one more question, or we could ask these 3 to sing the song. I don't know.
No.
I was going to bring my guitar, but I didn't.
Mark was going to do Hendrix.
Yeah.
One more
Another
question.
folk version.
Play it safe, go with the question? Okay. This is a good one. Sandy Doyle asks, and obviously she's got some insider knowledge because this is a good one. What was the significance of the Battle of Bread and Butter Creek?
Ooh, there you go. He's the only one who knows that.
It's usually not called that, but it did take place at Bread and Butter Creek. And we're referring to what's known also incorrectly as the Battle of North Point. So if you're familiar with the troops that landed at North Point and began to march toward Baltimore, at a narrowing in the Patapsco Peninsula, that's where there was this engagement, and that's where Robert Ross, the commander of the British land troops, was mortally wounded in a skirmish prior to the actual battle. And so the question is the significance, and it's interesting that she referred to it as Bread and Cheese Creek because, butter. Actually, I call it the other. But the battle itself, I would not say was very significant. And I know a lot of folks in Baltimore may not like to hear that. But the reason I say that is that, number one, it was an American defeat, okay? A lot of people don't tend to understand that. But the British retained on the battlefield. It was the Americans who withdrew. And you'll oftentimes hear Baltimoreans say, okay, but we delayed the British. It gave us more time to prepare the defenses. And all I'd like to remind you is that once Ross was mortally wounded and eventually died, it was his second who took over. And it was his second who ordered his men to rest for the rest of the day. It wasn't a follow-up. If Ross had not died, and if you think about what had happened at the Battle of Bladensburg, Ross ordered his men, after a major battle, to rest for 2 hours and then to march on into Washington, D.C. So people speculate what would have happened if Ross had not died at this skirmish. He probably would have done the same thing. So I don't think it's fair to really say that the Americans delayed the advance on Baltimore, because when Brooke took over, he had no ambition to go ahead and head up and immediately try to go to Baltimore. So the significance is that, if you want to call it a significant battle, is that the British won that battle. But ultimately, the British lost the entire attempt to take Baltimore. Now, if you want to read a British perspective of that, the British say that they withdrew. They were not defeated. And when you think about it, that's true. Because the defenders at Fort McHenry, as has already been pointed out, the British stayed outside, for the most part, of the range of the cannon at Fort McHenry. So the British were not forced to withdraw. The British did that on their own. They just said, it's not worth it. We're not going to continue to do this. After 25 hours, we haven't taken the fort. We're going to get out of there. The British received very little damage during the actual bombardment. So I don't know that you can, if you're a British individual, particularly a scholar like Peter Snow, who's recently done a book, they point out very clearly in their viewpoint that this was not an American victory. It was a British withdrawal. It all depends on what side of the line you're on, and that's history.
Could we get away with saying it's a victory for American marksmanship?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could say that, but
Lose the
you know,
general, that's not
I
a
think
good
it's
thing.
better to try to end on a high note. And
Okay.
to me, the significance of the War of 1812 is not just the Battle of Baltimore, although that's very significant to our history, but it's what happened after the war. And you probably know that it was a status quo antebellum, which means, in legal terms, everything went back exactly the way it was prior to the war. So you can't really argue that the United States won the war, nor could you argue that England won the war, because it was a draw. But morally, you could say that the United States won because we were able to withhold ourselves despite a superior force. The British were far superior in their ability to fight than we were. But what came out of it? What was the era known as after the War of 1812? It was known as the era of good feeling. And there was a new sense of patriotism. There was a new sense of confidence that people had in their country. And even more importantly, it was other countries that now had a different opinion of the United States. And they wanted to do more trading with the United States. And actually, our economy flourished immediately after the War of 1812. But the biggest thing that came out of it are the icons. The most significant icon is the Star-Spangled Banner. the flag, and the anthem. But we also have many other significant icons. Old Ironsides, Old Hickory, the slogan for the U.S. Navy, "Don't give up the ship." I mean, we could go on and on and on. These all come out of the War of 1812, and that's why all of us, particularly during this bicentennial, should be wanting to understand and better appreciate what that war did for us. It turned this country around. It was a pivot point. We could have gone down, and instead we went up. And that's an important part of American history.
That is a great note to end on. Please thank
One last thing. Uncle
Bert with the
Sam
last
came
word.
out of that war, too. I don't know whether you know that or not. Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. If I had a glass of anything other than water right now, I'd raise a toast. But with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for joining us. The night is not over. Please join us over at the gift and bookstore. We'll move the three guys up there real quick so you can get them to autograph your book if you'd like. And I hope we'll see you at future Marjorie Lynn Bank lectures. And have a great Star-Spangled celebration this weekend. Good night.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Well done. Well done.